El profesor Daniel Willingham es un académico de la Universidad de Virginia dedicado al estudio de la psicología cognitiva, que se ha hecho muy conocido en Estados Unidos y el mundo por sus esfuerzos de divulgación para el mundo educacional respecto a las lecciones de la ciencia del aprendizaje que son útiles para la práctica docente. Ha escrito libros muy relevantes en este tema, incluyendo ¿Por qué a los estudiantes no les gusta la escuela? Y La mente lectora, ambos traducidos por Aptus al español. Doctor Willingham, es realmente un gusto tener esta oportunidad de conversar con usted. Muchas gracias por darse el tiempo y entremos directamente en materia. La primera pregunta que le quiero hacer es, ¿por qué cree que es relevante que los educadores tengan un entendimiento de la ciencia del aprendizaje y en qué puede ayudarles a su práctica?
I think there are two ways that it can be helpful. One is that basic findings from cognitive psychology can serve as inspiration for new methods. So one of the extremely reliable findings is that if you are trying to commit something to memory, probing memory for that information when it's partially learned is a very effective way to cement that information in memory. So the classic experiments on this, you have students read a chapter of a history book, for example, and then they could study it again. They could read it a second time. Or another possibility is they read it once, and then instead of reading it a second time, they take a quiz and they try to remember some of the concepts that they've learned. It turns out that taking a quiz is actually better for memory than studying a second time. So this is called retrieval practice. It's extremely reliable effect. It's been tested in classroom situations with children of all sorts of different ages, with all sorts of different subject matter, and it always works. So this is one example. I think there's another completely different reason that teachers might want to know something about cognitive psychology. The way I've described this is that teachers, everybody will have a mental model of how children learn, or more broadly, they'll have a mental model of children. So it's very nice for me to tell a teacher, listen, here's, if you want your children to commit something to memory, cognitive psychology says, do this. If you want children to pay attention under these circumstances, cognitive psychology says, do that. Well, the teacher, that's fine, but the teacher's going to encounter many, many situations that we can't guess at, right? There's always something surprising in a classroom. My favorite story from this one, the daughter of a friend of mine started teaching, and she's teaching 7-year-olds, and she was about 3 months in. And I said, how are you finding it? How's your experience? She said, it's going pretty well. And I think my training was pretty good, but no one told me what to do with a spinner. And a spinner is a child who at random times gets up out of her seat, goes in the corner, and just begins to spin for the fun of it. So this is an example of, a situation that, so the teacher has to do something, right? She can't just say, listen, little girl, no one told me what to do with a spinner, so you just have to stop, right? They have to do so. And so obviously the way that this teacher is going to respond in this unexpected situation depends in part on her understanding of how children learn, what their emotional life is like, what motivates children, and so on. So it's not enough to just have a toolbox of standard things that I do for certain goals, because you're going to have unexpected things happen. And so cognitive psychology can help develop a better mental model of the learner, a better understanding of how children learn, what motivates them, what their emotional lives are like. So that's the second way in which I think study of this information can be useful.
En uno de sus artículos leí que usted hacía una analogía de educación con la arquitectura para relevar la importancia del entendimiento de la ciencia para la práctica. ¿Puede explicarnos esa analogía?
The architecture analogy is that I think teaching is more like architecture, that if you're an architect, there are principles of basic science you have to pay attention to. If you are building a home, building a house, you need to know some principles of physics and some principles of materials science, or the house is going to collapse, right? You can't just completely ignore those. And so I call those boundary conditions. You have to stay within the boundaries, and basic science, as opposed to applied science, basic science can be helpful. So an example of that is, if you want to be really proficient at something, practice has to be part of it. That's just a limit of human condition. But there aren't that many of those, but there are some. But then once you've respected the boundary conditions, you've got much more freedom to make the home beautiful and stay within budget, and you have all these other concerns in addition to science. So that's the architecture analogy, which I think is useful in thinking about, because sometimes people think, like, when you talk about using science to inform teaching, people think that means what that ends up being is scientists telling teachers how to teach, and I don't think that's the case at all.
Existen muchas lecciones de la ciencia del aprendizaje que creo son relevantes para la docencia. No podemos cubrir todo en esta conversación, así que propongo que nos focalicemos en un gran tema: la relación entre el conocimiento y las habilidades del pensamiento. Hoy en día es muy común escuchar que con la revolución de Internet, o incluso ahora con inteligencia artificial, todo el conocimiento está disponible en la palma de la mano, por lo que no tiene sentido un sistema educativo que busque desarrollar la acumulación de conocimiento en la memoria de los estudiantes, sino que debiera focalizarse fundamentalmente en desarrollar y practicar habilidades cognitivas. ¿Qué nos dice la psicología cognitiva respecto a esta afirmación? ¿Es esto verdad o no, y por qué?
It's not true. And it's, candidly, I think that idea is potentially very dangerous for our children. There's a lot we could say about this. Let me try to keep it relatively brief. And I think the easiest way, so the alternative way to think about this is that knowledge and the skills we want our children to have are really intertwined. So sometimes people say, you need to think of, like, you need something to think about. And I think it's more than that. It's not just, you need raw materials to put into this process of thinking, because that still implies that the thinking is separate from knowledge, and therefore, the knowledge can come from memory, but it also opens up the idea, the knowledge could come from the internet, it could come from outside of the child. But I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think it's better to think of them as intertwined. So let me give an example. Here's an example from one of my books. This is from reading comprehension. So suppose you read, Trisha spilled her coffee, Dan jumped up to get a rag. We would think nothing in terms of interpreting this. It'd be very straightforward. But I want to highlight how much knowledge goes into this and what the process is. So if you simply understood the two actions, Trisha spilled coffee, Dan jumped up out of his chair and went to get a rag, you haven't understood everything that the author intended. The author intended for you to understand a causal relationship. Dan jumped up to get a rag because Trisha spilled her coffee. Understanding that causal connection, there's information missing from the text. The information that's missing, that's not spelled out, is that when someone spills coffee, it makes a mess. You also need to know people don't like having a mess around, and you also need to know rags can clean a mess. So those three pieces of information create a bridge between Trisha spilled her coffee, Dan jumped up to get a rag. That information had to be in my head. Right? And the brain is matchless at this task of evaluating. It's all happening outside of awareness, of course, of evaluating what information is appropriate in this situation, and then bringing that information to consciousnness. A lot of things about spills and about coffee that did not come into mind when you comprehended Trisha spilled her coffee, Dan jumped up to get a rag. So, for example, imagine what your thought process would be if I had said Trisha spilled her coffee, Dan jumped up to get her more. Now a different process or different aspect of spilling. Another thing that you know about spilling, when someone spills something, they now have less of it than they did a moment ago. Or if I had said, Trisha spilled her coffee, Dan jumped up howling in pain. Still another aspect of spilling. The reason I'm going through this in some detail is compare your brain to Google in this case, right? Your brain is very, very good at homing in not just on the missing knowledge, but on the missing knowledge that is appropriate to this context, right? And omitting all this other stuff that you know about spills and about rugs and about the temperature of coffee, things in the situation that aren't important, aren't relevant for comprehension. So this is one reason that your brain is much, much better at providing information than Google is. Google knows much, much more than your brain does. There's no doubt, obvious, that's very obvious, but Google is not good with context. The other thing Google is not good with is speed. We think of Google as wonderful, and it is, not only because it's complete, but because it's fast. Now, if I read Trisha spilled her coffee, Dan jumped up to get a rag, and I thought, I'm confused. There must be something I don't get about this. Let me look up coffee or whatever. I could look at these books behind me. The information may not even be in there. And if it is, it's going to take me a very long time to find it. So Google's very superior to looking things up in books, but it's very inferior to your mind. Your brain is much faster than Google. And we've all experienced this, that, we've all experienced the context problem. The context problem is you look up coffee and you get all, 1 million, 2 million hits. But we also know we have limited patience for looking things up. That's not the context problem. That's the speed problem, right? If I have to stop and look things up, I lose the thread of the story. I forget what it was that I was thinking about. All of this, I've been going on for a while here, but all of this is just about reading comprehension. We could do the same sort of analysis for history, for science, for civics, for drama, for mathematics, and so on. Having the right kind of knowledge in your mind is absolutely essential. And educators should not think that Google or AI is going to end up being a suitable substitute. Those are very powerful technologies, they're very useful, but they're not a replacement for knowledge.
¿Puede darnos ejemplos del rol del conocimiento en habilidades del pensamiento? Por ejemplo, ¿cuál es el rol del conocimiento en pensamiento crítico?
Sure. So start with critical thinking is people mean a lot of different things by critical thinking. The way a cognitive psychologist would typically break that up is one thing is the very practical matter of identifying whether information you encounter is true or false. Another aspect of it is reasoning, where you're taking bits of information and then deriving a new conclusion from them. Still another is decision making. And this is something that schools don't emphasize very much, but is a very important practical matter. So if I'm making a decision like, should I get the COVID vaccine or not? That involves reasoning. I need to understand medical information about the risk to me if I take the vaccine, that there may be risks associated with it, and understanding the probability of those risks and what those probabilities really mean. And then the risk to me if I don't get the vaccine and I end up getting COVID and so on. Right? So decision-making has a lot of practical significance. And I'm unfamiliar with the situation in your schools. In our schools, students make no decisions at all. They need to ask permission to go to the bathroom. They're 17 years old, and they're not allowed to just make the decision. I need to go to the bathroom. So that's a different problem. But and then finally, problem solving. So this is a big topic that you opened when you thought about critical thinking. But generally, I'll just give an example of how knowledge plays into all of these factors. One of the things that's really crucial, whether it's reasoning, decision-making, or problem solving, is understanding the situation in front of you. and that really requires specific knowledge about about that situation. So, for example, a common example is military situations. And actually, in a recent book, I give an example from the U.S. Civil War. So there was a battle in which the general on one side got an enormous intelligence break because someone found the movement orders for the opposing army. So one general knew where everybody was going to be and where they planned on traveling. And so in what I'm writing, I show a map of what where everybody was as far as the general knew, and then what the plans were. And I say, okay, you're the general that's had this intelligence break. What should you do? And the point of course, the reader's not going to know, right? And the point of this is information is not enough. In order to really understand deeply a situation, in order to be able to solve a problem, you need background information to be able to put things into context. What this opposing general knew was sort of capabilities of the different types of units. He knew travel times, how long it would likely take. He knew the influence of terrain, all sorts of other stuff I can't guess at because I'm not a general, right? And so this is just a peek at why background knowledge is so important, that I think is easy for people to understand. Before you start reasoning, before you start making a decision, before you start solving a problem, you have to understand what's going on. And understanding what's going on is not just a matter of assembling information. The information that's in your mind makes a tremendous contribution in putting context around that information you've gotten from the environment.
En la presentación previa, hablé un poco de las limitaciones de la memoria de trabajo. Desde la psicología cognitiva sabemos que el conocimiento en la memoria de largo plazo ayuda en parte a superar las limitaciones de la memoria de trabajo, que es donde ocurre el pensamiento. ¿Puede comentarnos cómo ayuda el conocimiento previo al proceso de pensamiento?
The limitation of working memory is a very, it's usually referred to as a bottleneck. It's like everything gets slowed down if working memory is slowed down, and working memory makes a contribution to everything that we care about in school, problem solving and in all fields, reading comprehension and so on. So knowledge helps because it enables a process called chunking that the limitation, the size limitation of working memory is relieved if you can chunk information. So for example, the simplest example is if I ask you to keep in working memory some letters, and if they're just random letters like A, X, Z, Q, L, M, and so on, you'll be able to keep maybe 7 letters in working memory, something like that. But if I say B, L, U, E, R-E-D, you're quickly perceive, oh, you're spelling words. And now this is the process of chunking, that you remember B-L-U-E as one unit as blue. That takes up about as much room, tiny bit more, about as much room in working memory as just one letter did. Notice that this depends on long-term memory. For me to recognize B-L-U-E as a sequence, I have to know how to spell the English word blue. If I started spelling words in a language that you don't know, that's not going to help. That's going to seem like it's random. So that's the way that knowledge contributes to another way that knowledge contributes to thinking. If you have a lot of knowledge about a topic, you're able to engage in this chunking process, and then that creates more space in working memory, and working memory is sort of the staging ground for thinking.
Ya establecimos que el conocimiento es muy relevante para el proceso mismo de pensar, por lo tanto, es importante enseñar conocimiento. Sabemos también, desde la psicología cognitiva, que nuestra memoria aprende conectando nueva información con lo que ya sabemos. Dado esto, pareciera ser deseable enseñar muchas cosas, de manera que los estudiantes tengan la base para poder entender y aprender de muchas cosas nuevas. Pero por otro lado, sabemos también que la comprensión profunda requiere revisitar ciertas ideas varias veces, lo que implicaría enseñar menos cosas. La pregunta siguiente entonces es, ¿cómo definimos qué conocimiento priorizar para ser enseñado por el sistema escolar? Y por otro lado, dada la importancia de conectar aprendizajes nuevos con conocimientos previos, ¿cuán relevante es la secuencia en que enseñamos el conocimiento?
Different types of knowledge serve different purposes. If you go very, very broad, then the student will be more capable of engaging with content on a broader set of topics. Like that's very intuitive. For a while, I haven't done this for the last, I guess since the pandemic, I haven't done this, but for a while, I made a real habit of asking parents, what is your goal for your child's reading when they graduate high school? And none of them were surprised by this question, and they all had a ready answer. And almost always they said, I would like my child to be able to be a good general reader. I'd like them to be able to read a serious newspaper, a serious magazine, and understand it. Like that's my goal. Without realizing it, they had an opinion about curriculum. This gets at your question about breadth, right? In order for me to pick up a newspaper and be ready to read any article that's in it, I need to have quite broad knowledge, right? We talked in the Dan spilled coffee, Trisha jumped up to get it right. We talked about the importance of knowledge to reading comprehension. The writers and editors of a newspaper or magazine have certain things that they expect their readership is familiar with, and that the writer does not need to explain. The basic expectations of a general, serious newspaper or magazine are 1,000,000 miles wide, but only a couple of inches deep. Right? In contrast, you could imagine a curriculum that really goes deep. Right? This does the type of curriculum I just described prepares you to read a newspaper. It doesn't prepare you to read a more technical serious book on astronomy or anything else, really. And so there's an argument to be made that that's not a good way to go. Instead, you should ask biologists what are the really central ideas in your field. And they're probably going to say evolution and a handful of other things. You say, okay, for to really understand evolution deeply and to understand the core of this field, our students don't need a 6-week unit on evolution when they're 15 years old. The idea of evolution needs to be introduced when they are 8 years old, and they need to revisit it in all its different aspects throughout their schooling and go much deeper. So in terms of what type of knowledge, whether it's broad versus it depends on what your goals are for schooling. The other aspect of the what I'll point out is that this is science doesn't say anything about this. This is a reflection of values and what the society, broadly speaking, thinks it's important for children to know. Things are going to be omitted. I don't know about your system in the U.S. Educators do not, politicians really not educated. Politicians do not like talking about this at all. They like to pretend schools are going to do everything. We're going to make everybody creative and a wonderful citizen. It's not true. You can't do everything. Time is limited, and so you have to make difficult choices. So yeah, the other thing is you brought up sort of knowledge building on knowledge, and that's the other, you've touched on the other really, really important aspect of curriculum. You're absolutely right. So again, it just goes to, as I'm trying to teach you something new, I'm probably assuming some other knowledge, right? We saw in this very simple, Dan spilled his coffee, Trisha jumped up to get her, actually, I think I reversed it. It's Trisha who spills coffee. I never spill coffee. Trisha spilled her coffee. Dan jumped up to get a rack. Even in this very simple example, knowledge is embedded. And so what that means is in order to fully understand a text, the child needs to have nearly all of the knowledge that's assumed by the writer, the child needs to already know. And they just need to reach, the text makes them reach just a little bit, right? And think. Most of it's clear, most of it they've already got the knowledge, but they have to think here and there in order to learn something new. So what that means is if I'm a teacher and I'm going to present a child with a text like that, I need to really know what the child already knows. And that speaks to this importance of sequencing in curriculum, that if I'm teaching children who are 15 years old, I really need to know what did they learn when they were 14, so that I can build on that and give them that text where they're mostly going to be comfortable. They're mostly going to understand it, but it takes them that one step farther.
Considerando lo anterior, ¿cómo enseñamos conocimiento para fomentar la comprensión? Una típica crítica o sospecha respecto a quienes promueven la enseñanza del conocimiento es que saberse cosas de memoria por simple repetición no fomenta la comprensión.
Yeah, I mean, knowledge is pretty rote when you first acquire it. You know, it's hard for us to remember, like when we were first learning a new subject, but this is sort of the natural way that knowledge develops. Initially, it is going to be kind of like you don't understand it very deeply. You know, the example I give in one of my books is force equals mass times acceleration. So I tell you that, and then you say like, okay, you know, like that would just be memorized. And then I give you definitions of each of those terms, and like it still doesn't help very much. So what do? I give you some examples, and I talk about a golf club that's going to be the force, and then it's hitting a golf ball that has a small mass, so it's really going to accelerate. Or the golf club, same force, it hits a big truck, but it's obvious that's a big mass, so you're not going to have much acceleration. So now it makes a little bit more sense, but your knowledge is still pretty shallow, right? What's going to make understanding really feel rich and deep? Well, it's when not only that you have lots of different examples and you see how they all tie together. They're all examples of this. And sometimes it's not force equals mass times acceleration. It's mass equals acceleration divided by 4, right? And you have different, and then also you see how mass behaves in other sorts of relationship to other sorts of variables. Right? It's connections that leads to deep understanding, and those build over time. So this speaks, by the way, to the when you're talking about curriculum, if you're worried about shallow understanding and you want your students to have deep understanding, I'm emphasizing that takes time. That indicates, well, you better be modest in your expectations about how much they're going to cover. You can't say, I want a very, very broad curriculum and I want all of it to be deep understanding. That's not in the cards. This is a boundary condition, right? It's like, this is what you're hoping for is lovely. It's impossible too. And so you have to make difficult choices.
Entonces, de alguna manera, hay que elegir algunos temas en que vamos a buscar comprensión profunda. Pero también es importante enseñar muchos otros temas a los que es importante que los estudiantes igual sean expuestos, y tal vez tenemos que conformarnos con que en esos aprendizajes va a ser más superficial.
That's beautifully put. Yeah, I mean, the way I think of it is shallow knowledge is much better than no knowledge. And in addition, the other way I put it to teachers is, think about memory. You know that things that students don't revisit a number of times, a lot of them are going to forget it. And so you have to have some topics where you say to yourself, I do not, it's unacceptable that a child would graduate high school and not really know this and remember it. And then there's a lot of things that they're going to be exposed to. And for some of these children, a fire will start and they'll be so excited and they'll want to pursue it and so on. For many children, it will be, oh, that was fun and interesting. And then 2 years later, they probably have forgotten it. And we have to, as educators, we have to decide that we can live with that.
También conectando con el tema del conocimiento. En su libro ¿Por qué a los estudiantes no les gusta la escuela?, habla de la diferencia entre principiantes y expertos en cómo piensan y aprenden. ¿Puede hablarnos de este tema y posibles consecuencias para la enseñanza en aula?
Sure, and again, it's a big topic, so we'll try and keep it manageable and informative. Again, a huge the most noticeable difference between experts and novices is in the speed and sophistication with which they can analyze situations and get to what is important in that situation. So a lot of this work is in medicine. And what you find just behaviorally, what you'll see is a very experienced physician compared to an intern who is just getting started. The very experienced physician analyzes cases much more quickly and discards lots of information, ignores lots of information. If you then 2 days later ask a novice and an expert about a case they saw 48 hours earlier, the novice will remember many more details about the case because the expert has, on the spot decided most of this is irrelevant, and they get to what's really important. This is a process of recognition. It's really recognizing patterns and thereby deciding what's really the crucial features of this case. You see the same thing in chess. A chess master looks at a chessboard. They don't see individual pieces. They see relationships, and they interpret those relationships functionally. So they'll see Rodrigo's is dominating. His pieces are dominating the left side of the board. He's mounting an attack from there. I, on the other hand, have good control of the right center of the board. I think my king is well protected, right? And so those are the terms they talk in. And what that allows me to do is immediately see what part of the board is safe and I can ignore it. Where am I in trouble? And then that's where I focus cognition. Right? Same as the physicians. Sometimes they'll just recognize, oh, this is that sort of a problem, and here's what we do, standard remedy to that problem. Other times, they're engaging in a lot of problem solving, but their problem solving is very focused by virtue of their recognition. So, there's a lot of memory, and the memory is organized differently. It's organized functionally compared to the memory representations in novices.
En educación existe a veces una intuición que si los estudiantes descubren el conocimiento por su cuenta en vez de que alguien se los enseñe, lo van a aprender mejor, por lo que se promueven metodologías pedagógicas por descubrimiento, donde los estudiantes deben investigar por su cuenta para adquirir nuevos conocimientos. Dado que los estudiantes escolares son en buena medida principiantes en todos los conocimientos que busca desarrollar la escuela, ¿en qué medida la falta de conocimientos previos relevantes puede incidir en la capacidad de los estudiantes de distinguir qué es relevante o accesorio en su proceso de investigación y por lo tanto en la efectividad de estas metodologías para desarrollar los aprendizajes?
Yes. So there are a few things to really think about in the use of discovery learning, based on what I've said and a few other ideas. First is that discovery learning needs to be very, very carefully planned. And I think you hinted at this in your question, that if I just sort of, the reason discovery learning looks attractive is that it seems like it's really a motivation issue, that it seems like this is going to be more fun. This is going to be more interesting. If I, rather than me, talking on, I'm able to ignite some excitement in the child. But how much learning is going to take place? It really it depends on the environment. You're now depending on the environment for instructive feedback if it's true discovery learning. So the example I give in one of my books is frog dissection. You give the children a knife and a frog and you say, go learn something, kids. It's just not that likely. The place where discovery learning works very well, and this is actually when people champion discovery learning, this is frequently the example they give, is kids learning how to play video games on their own. And it is true. Like, you sit a child down in front of a video game, don't give them any instructions. They just sort of mess around. Well, notice that in that environment, they're getting very immediate feedback, Like, oh, I tried this. Oh, I died. Okay, so that's not a good thing to do. I did that. Oh, look, that guy sparkled. Why did they sparkle? Let me figure out, what it means when someone who I thought was an enemy sparkles, right? So you get this very, very immediate feedback. So when you are no longer providing a lot of explicit instruction, I think without realizing it, you are hoping that the environment is going to provide that instruction. That's sometimes true, and it's sometimes not at all true. And so you want to be thinking about what's the feedback they're going to get from the environment. And then, as you described, Rodrigo, how is the child going to interpret that feedback? Is this the environment may be telling the child something. The child's not ready to interpret it. They don't have the background knowledge to actually know what's going on, right? So I sort of, jokingly said, like, you give the child a scalpel and a frog and say, good luck. Someone who has a lot of expertise in frog anatomy and physiology probably could learn something, right? They might open up the frog and say, oh, this frog is a different species than others I've seen, right? Because they've got all this background knowledge. Whereas a child, it's probably just going to say, ew, and that, not much more happens, right? So does that get at your question?
Sí, estoy de acuerdo. Muchas veces lo que motiva a educadores a utilizar estas metodologías es la búsqueda de motivación, que sin duda es una condición necesaria e importante, pero no suficiente para el aprendizaje. Si el entorno no provee la retroalimentación precisa necesaria, puede que ocurra motivación sin aprendizaje. La otra razón por la que en ocasiones se promueven proyectos de investigación en grupo, por ejemplo, es porque se buscan metas formativas, como la autonomía o la capacidad de colaborar, lo que obviamente es muy importante. Sin embargo, muchas veces no se enseña explícitamente, por ejemplo, cómo colaborar de forma efectiva, lo que hace que también haya que aprender por descubrimiento cómo colaborar. Esto puede llegar a proyectos grupales que no sean efectivos ni en sus metas formativas ni en la de aprendizaje que se buscaban con el proyecto mismo.
And I think both of those are really worthy goals. And again, notice how, we've already talked about sort of when we talk about curriculum, we're like, well, what's your goal here? What are you trying to get at? And here we're seeing the same thing. Like, to what extent is it important to you that your children learn autonomy and, sometimes have the feeling like, teacher's not going to tell me what to do. I need to decide what I'm interested in. I think that's a very worthy goal, right? The question is, how are you going to configure it? And is it coming at a time where there's content knowledge that you think it's really important that the child acquire? Or is it going to come in a context where, it'd be nice if they learn something I don't care that much. I more want them to have the experience of having a decision that a decision they need to make. They take responsibility for it and so on. And then also I'll just briefly mention the idea of intriguing the child. That's of course, absolutely essential. And I think that, teachers are right to worry that if we just sit down and start talking to the child, that this is going to be really boring. The way I've described this is that very often what we want children to learn is really the answer to a question. The question is so obvious to us that we don't think of the fact that the child hasn't thought of the question. And so the question really needs to be elaborated and explained. And this is where, we appeal to children's experience and we say, look, this happens. Isn't that strange when you think about it? Why is it that, when you throw a stone, it looks like this, and when a stick is in water, it looks like it's bent, but it's really, whatever. These are stupid examples, but you know what I mean. In some way sort of get the child reflecting on their experience and show there's actually an interesting question that underlies this common experience that you've had. I think that's not the only, by any means, technique, but one way of getting at one of the desirable features of discovery learning, which is triggering curiosity. So yeah, I think that the aspects of discovery learning are they're really onto something important, but shaping it in a way where children end up learning what you're hoping they're going to learn is I think it's frequently underestimated how tricky that is.
Dado todo lo que hemos conversado de la importancia del conocimiento, ¿por qué será que la enseñanza del conocimiento tiene mala reputación en círculos educativos? Muchas veces escuchamos a gente muy inteligente, tanto dentro como fuera del sistema educativo, que mientras promueven cosas como la enseñanza de habilidades del siglo XXI, de alguna manera ningunean al conocimiento y al sistema escolar de pasada, tratándolo de obsoleto por tratar de enseñar conocimiento.
Yeah, I think a few reasons. One is that I think smart people talk down knowledge because they don't realize how important their own knowledge is in their thinking. That's the first thing. The second thing is when people say we need skills, they're of course right. I mean that is the main thing that we don't want children to have memorized a bunch of dates in history just so that they know a bunch of dates in history. We want them to be able to use that knowledge in critical thinking. The type of critical thinking that I've referred to before, problem solving, decision making, reasoning, this is harder. It's easier to memorize dates than it is to learn how to reason about history. The knowledge is probably going to come first because is going to come first because it's just easier. And so what you often see, you often see children who know some stuff don't really seem to know how to use it very well because that's the beginning of the educational path and they've gotten stuck for some reason. You seldom or never see kids who are really, really good at reasoning about history. They just happen not to know any history, right? So that's the problem that we see. And so that's the problem that we address. And the third reason is, and this sort of goes back to the first instance of, experts denigrating knowledge. This illusion that you can think about them separately. And then especially, people have been saying you can always look things up since long before computers were around. But today with the internet, that seems all the more plausible that you just get the information you need from the environment. It doesn't need to be in your head. It seems more obvious that skills do need to be in your head. And therefore, let's just teach skills directly.
Dr. Willingham, muchas gracias por darse el tiempo de conversar con nosotros.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.